Hi, Kent. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to get straight into it because, I speak to many people all the way from senior partners, CEOs, and so on. But I was looking forward to speaking to you because I think what you have to say is relevant to our audience, but also the time when we're having this discussion because it's the beginning of the year when people have to make big decisions about what they want to achieve for the entire year. So, my first question is a bit of a hard question, but I'll put it out there anyway. In the world of elite management consulting, strategy consulting, working at McKinsey, Bain, and so on, and many other firms that are grouped in that space, we are trained as partners and senior partners to never talk about revenue and sales. It's a word we don't use. I don't use the word revenue. I don't use the word sales. We do not talk about it. We are trained not to talk about it. We are trained only to talk about the client. But of course, it's a skill we need to develop. Otherwise, the firms just don't exist. So what I want to ask you to start off with is, knowing our audience is going to have this barrier when they listen to this podcast, how do we get them comfortable talking and thinking about sales and revenue as a starting point?
It's an interesting question. I think it's not so much what you talk about, but how you talk about it. And by that, I mean that value and value propositions are in the eyes of the beholder.
Yeah.
And if your client thinks in terms of revenue optimization, sales optimization, and things like that, I feel that if you don't use that language, you're not connected, you're not engaged, and it'd be really difficult to show empathy or impact to a client. Now, I can understand where it would be awkward or difficult, but if you're doing Salesforce transformation and
Yeah.
Salesforce optimization, I don't know how you avoid that kind of language and those kinds of words. The other comment I will make is this: at the end of the day, if your project and your consulting doesn't impact profits and revenue, then I don't know what the purpose is.
Yeah, that's a good point. So let's step back a little bit and think about, I know many clients we have who start their own consulting firms, whether they were senior partners before or relatively more junior people, but by and large, 80% are going to fail. And that's not a made up statistic. Consultants start many boutiques that don't do well. You obviously know that.
Yes.
And all of them have this idea that if they just have the best toolkit, methodology, and they work really hard and they beat the floor, they fly to every single client, they're going to do well. But it doesn't work that way, right? You're laughing because it's true.
Well, here's what's interesting. It was true.
Yeah.
It was true last century. If you had or offered a superior product or
Yeah.
service or awesome customer experience, that was the model and the path to success and growth and gobble market share. However, those days are gone, yet too many people are stuck in the past because it worked at one time. And that's a lot of what I talk about in speeches and presentations is you've got to get over what worked in the past. And some of these adages like if it's not broken, don't fix it.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you need to fix it because in many cases it is broken or it's not working as well as it could. And this is part of the big problem I find out there is that a lot of things still work today that worked in the past. They're just the impact and the incremental success is enough to keep people doing things and being reinforced to do it that way. As opposed to saying, you know what, things have changed. The world is different. We're a services-based economy. There's just so many things that people are just so reluctant to give up. And I have to tell you, I think a lot of senior management, I think a lot of the academia are still reinforcing old paradigms, old models, and old myths. And I'll go ahead and share one with you and let me know if I'm on the right path. But the classic model of start, run, and grow a business and you will be successful is gone. It's absolutely been shattered. Offer great products, superior services, and an awesome customer experience. Those days are gone. Everybody offers those things, and growing a business doesn't mean you're making any money. And that's why so many startups, entrepreneurs, and even large corporations are cash poor. They might be growing, but they're actually not making any money. They're not creating a profitable wealth inside the firm or the business or the corporation or the organization. That goes for state and local agencies. It goes for nonprofits. And so Yeah, it's a case where there's so many paradigms that are gone. I've been fortunate. I've had half my career last century,
Hmm.
half my career this century, and I've seen the trends, the patterns, those things that worked, and I've been able to watch how those things are losing their effectiveness. Yet people are so hesitant to change.
Well, what you're saying makes sense, and you see it every day. We speak to many people from McKinsey and Goldman Sachs who want to set up startups. And that sounds good. You want to launch a new business. So, what is your plan? Well, my plan is to create a business plan, raise some money, hire a lot of people, create a product, and maybe eventually we'll make some money. But no one talks about how to make money. For them, a business means hiring people, raising money, putting in all the commercial arrangements. But where's the part about what the customer wants and how you're going to make money? Is there another easier way to do this?
Yeah. So you just touched on, I tell you, if I can ever teach the world anything or help see what I've learned, you just touched on it. And the way you said it, the chain of events was I'll start a business, I'll offer product or services, I'll hire people, and hopefully someday I'll make some money. It's completely backwards.
Yeah.
It doesn't work anymore. And so I talk a lot about phases to optimizing your wealth. And it starts not with you and somebody wanting to start a business. It starts with what's broken in the marketplace that's not being served. And if you don't have that premise, then there is no reason for a business. And you shouldn't think about starting a business. And I hope no one gives you any money because you're not going to create a sustainable business. From there, then the next most important step is then defining what's a model that can solve this problem in a way that's not being solved or a superior way. And then what are the revenue streams that you can attach to it to monetize it? And if you can't answer those three questions, stop. Don't go any further because the odds of you being successful are so stacked against you. And now you're just burning money, cash, and time and resources. And you really have to start with what's missing out there? What's fundamentally broken? And then start with that premise. And if I could say anything about that is forget about yourself and forget about your company. And you don't need a plan yet. You need a problem to solve.
Now, one of the things you talk about quite a lot is the idea of making sure you have a business model. You know, it's good, it's fine to know what's broken in the market and not working great. You have a way to fix it, but how are you going to make money? How are you going to get customers to give you cash such that you have sufficient cash flow in your bank? You know, one of the things that we take for granted, especially in consulting, is that we charge clients per hour or per project since the beginning of mankind.
Yes.
But consulting has never developed a new way to make money. It's just one revenue stream that the majority of firms use. Few others are more, creative. But I think what happens is a lot of us get caught into a paradigm where we think that, hey, these are the coolest guys, these are the best guys in the industry. They are doing it this way. Therefore, we have to do it this way. How do you get clients to think more creatively around business models? Because a business model can be anything provided it's successful for you, right?
So, and a great question. And first of all, you want to define or develop a model that's different or unique, that truly brings a differentiating value proposition. But let's take consulting, because I was actually brought into this world back in '95. I was working inside GM EDS, and I was asked by the leaders to form a team and go inside and work on optimizing the strategic business units. And I brought in some of my friends from A.T. Kearney. I brought in some performance management experts. I brought in some marketing experts. I formed a team. I can't remember, it was 10 or 12 people. Spent a year inside each account. It was about $1 million. Now, it was pro bono to the account. But that is where I got my first taste of consulting and spending a lot of time with management consultants. And the stories I would hear is you're only as good as your current project, and so buried in your project you can't do the marketing and sales to get the next project, and you live on this roller coaster of projects. And so in 2002, when I thought, I want to go help companies and I want to go fix things, I didn't think of I want to be a consultant. I just wanted to solve problems. I said, one of the problems I have to solve is I need to be entrepreneurial and look at the whole consulting model differently. And the way I looked at it was, I said, I don't want to charge by the hour, because the problem there is the same one I have with my attorneys and lawyers, that I know if I pick up the phone, the meter starts to run, and then I don't want to call them. I don't want to work with them. And then there's such a conflict of interest. And so I started out, and I've been using it now for almost 20 years, is a retainer-based model, to where in this model for X amount of dollars a month, you get so much in the way of services, template tools, and methods. And here's something else I do that's radically different from, I think, most management consulting. I share my IP.
Yeah.
I share some of my most valuable templates, some that took years to develop, and I've polished them. They're on version 15 to 16, and I share those. I give those away. And those are part of the retainer. And it's interesting how some of my clients they just go bonkers over, wow, you've given us your methods, your formulas, your techniques, your templates, your tools. I had somebody send me an email the other day, and they said, I'm still using one of your templates from 10 years ago. I still use your interview matrix from 10 years ago that you shared with us. And see, what's counter is it's like, oh my gosh, if you give up your IP or you give things away, you won't have any work, or you devalue the work. And I found out just the opposite. I used to have clients the first few years that would stay in my programs for 6 to 9 months. I have clients in my program that have been 10 years now.
Yeah.
And you got to write a pretty big check to be in one of my high intensity programs, because it's dedicated to me and the templates and tools and the on-call, on-demand support. But that's counterintuitive, and I think that's what's so important to any industry is you have to look at your model and say, is there a better way? How does the client want these things? And I talk about a staffing company that we were in a prospect meeting, and we were presenting like we normally do, and I was watching them and I helped them prepare a little bit, and it wasn't going the way it should have gone. And we stopped the meeting and just said, we're off track. And they agreed. And they said, how do you want this? How do you want it to look? How do you want to buy it? How do you want to pay for it? Let's just start from a white sheet of paper and go from here. And oh my gosh, from that meeting, we doubled the size of the company. The money we generated in that single meeting was the size of the company at the time. And it was because we got out of the old mold or the old model and said, let's just make this all about you. Forget our model. So those are some of the thoughts I find. And now having a management consulting firm now for 18, 19 years, I really don't worry too much about projects ending and starting and finding new clients and marketing and selling and all those things. I run on retained programs. Now I also do surgical workshops and speeches and keynotes and things like that. But my bread and butter is the retained programs, and I just press so much value into those that people don't want to leave.
So it sounds as if you've built a portfolio of revenue streams, but you have one primary way of running your business, and the others serve a means of introducing you to people, getting them to understand more of what you're doing. You're obviously adding a lot of value, but it's giving different clients who are at different price points a way to interact with you. At the same time, for those clients who can afford what you would call your premium services, there's more value there. So I want to step back. I've read a lot of your work and I've seen some of your videos. It seems to me, and I could be wrong about this, but let's step back and get people to understand what's happening here. Is it correct to say the underlying premise of what you are teaching is that you've defined, or you've looked at how people run their businesses, and you've said, okay, what I want you to do now is to be more productive. I want you to create more output value for the same amount of effort you're putting in versus just working harder and doing more things. So if you were spending X amount of dollars doing X and putting out so many books and so on to create so much money, is there a way for us to reduce the effort you're making by pinpointing areas you've ignored and creating more value? Is that a good way of summarizing this? Or are we missing certain things?
Yeah, let me add to that and kind of put it in perspective. So the object is to help people to move from this more from more concept.
Yes.
If I make more, if I produce more, if I bring on more clients, if I sell more services, if I hire more people, if I add more locations, I'll make more money. Well, you will. You should increase your revenues, but the
effort is substantial.
You'll eat up your profits, and that's been kind of the mantra for last century. And again, one of those paradigms I'm really working to move companies off of. And I've come along and said, let's understand more from less, but not in the perverse way that a lot of companies, and now especially in the pandemic times, they're doing more from less way, making their people work harder, they're squeezing their vendors, they're cutting their prices. I mean, they're just, now they've kind of whiplashed over into a different perverse more from less. And what I'm really sharing is what I call the difference between business growth and revenue growth. And the subtlety there is that you should look at every area, every asset that you have and ask yourself, is there a way to generate more revenue from that asset without spending more money or increasing the cost? And so being more productive, efficiency, and all those things have ceilings. What doesn't have is a way to scale. An example I use a lot of times is I was taught what scaling meant, that I could scale up my operations, I could scale up my team, I could add more for more. But scaling in my world, the way I define revenue growth is I'm actually growing more revenue. So I have an account, one of my clients, and a lot of the clients, matter of fact, so they have 5 salespeople producing 10 million a year. So if I can help that sales team produce 15 million a year, or one salesperson produce 15 million a year, I just eliminated 8 categories of cost for a salesperson. Mm-hmm. And literally what I've done then is I've actually created wealth because I didn't burn the profits, the cash, the money to buy the growth. So I don't want people just to think, oh, well, this is about efficiency and this is about increasing production and streamlining and all that, and even into Kaizen. No, it's really the most pure form of optimization. In other words, you are producing more from every asset that you have in your company. That's from contracts, from clients, from your employees, from your products, from your services. Everything is actually producing more, 3x, 5x, 10x, and your costs are minimal, or sometimes you don't have any. For example, if a company produces less proposals and wins more versus loses less, they just eliminated a lot of their proposal costs, their support costs, their sales management costs. And so I'm on this track of helping companies, and you say we can't talk about sales or revenue. I'm on this track to help companies and leaders and consultants starting companies is learn how to make money.
Yes, what you say is true, because most companies have a view of productivity as being very operations focused. And that's how they interpret it, which is why it becomes an efficiency measure, an output measure, and so on.
Yes.
But it's obviously not the definition of productivity, it's just the way people interpret it. But the examples you give are good examples whereby it's not always doing more with less, it's also doing more with what you have versus building in an additional layer of costs to do more, right? So the example you gave is a nice one whereby if you have a sales team of 5 people, normally what a company would do if they wanted to double revenue, it would say we need to bring in another 5 people, right?
Yes.
But what you're saying is, okay, let's step aside here for a second. Let's map out the process that the sales team uses. And the example you gave in one of your books is that maybe the funnel is incorrect. Maybe we've got a funnel of 50% of the leads that shouldn't be there, and we need to fix the funnel as opposed to doubling the number of salespeople. That's a good way of thinking about it, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the avenues, and one of the core messages. And I usually get the phone call because sales or revenue or cash flow is off, and I come in and I look at the organization and they're sold in their mind it's a sales problem, salespeople problem, sales organization problem, and I actually 9 out of 10, almost 99% of the time, it's not. It's an organizational issue. The business wasn't ready to generate the most amount of revenue possible. And so they try to pin the problem. And you know this from consulting, they're treating the symptoms, not the root cause. They try and pin it on the people or the manager or the department versus, you know what, when we look at things holistically and systemically, what we discover is, strategically your targeting was off, and from an operations standpoint, your product was priced improperly, and you're not talking to the right prospects. And so when we look at things holistically, we start to discover that it's not a people or a department problem; it's the whole company's problem. And a great example of that is, I don't know if I've ever walked into a company and they've said, "Wow, we just have too much demand. We have too many clients. We're just." We're printing money so fast that the printing machines are on fire and smoke's coming out. I've just never walked into that company. And so one of my questions is, well, how do you create demand? And then they say, well, what do you mean by demand? I said, leads, suspects, prospects, people that want to buy what you offer. And it's so interesting. It's always, well, we have our salespeople make cold calls, or we do a lot of SEO, or we hire more salespeople, or we go to events. And it's typically always a marketing or a sales area. And I said, well, you're missing out on 70, 80% of the demand you could have if you could get your whole organization, the whole enterprise, to start to become responsible for creating leads and demand. In other words, demand can come from operations. It can come from support. It can come from both marketing and sales. Now, it's critical that I make somebody accountable. So if it's somebody in marketing or leadership or sales, that they're accountable, that we create the demand we need. But to also make them accountable and responsible is missing out on so much more. And that's now I'm back to scaling and I'm back to more from less. When I could get all parts of the enterprise, including partnerships and vendors, helping you create more leads, suspects, web hits, traffic, then all of a sudden your sales and revenues can go through the roof, but your cost didn't change. And that's the thing I want people to learn is that you have to look at optimization differently. You've got to move off thinking in incremental terms. How do I add 10%, 20%, or how do I get a salesperson to sell 20% more? How do you get a salesperson to generate 5 times what their quota is? Well, you don't look at them and you don't look at even their methodology. You look at the system and how it's set up to help them produce those kind of results.
Okay, this is interesting. So I want to unpack this for the listeners, okay? Because a lot of valuable things here.
Yes.
Let's start with the first very interesting statement you made. You said when you go into many companies, and I agree with this, they're not ready to get the scale that they want. And they think the problem lies with sales, right? And example you gave here is you said that when you look at the sales force, it's not that necessarily they do anything wrong. It's the system that they're a part of that doesn't allow them to be hitting a 5 times growth, right? And because no one's changing the system, they're trying to optimize a system that's not very good, so you can only maybe creak out another 10% from it. So rather than looking at the salesperson, let's call her Amy, and say, Amy, we're going to fire you unless you increase sales by 30%, you've got to figure out what Amy represents. I mean, she's part of a system. Do we need to change the system and leave Amy alone? Maybe she's doing everything pretty well, but the system needs to change. But how does a business understand where the problem lies? Because, CEOs all the time have 100 different priorities. I'm not saying sales is not important. It obviously is very important. But what can you tell people that allow them on Monday morning to go into the office and say, hey, you know what? I listened to this guy called Kent Billingsley. His name is Billing, so he obviously knows how to generate money. And he told me this. Well, how do you trigger them on Monday morning? I think that's a very important thing.
Yeah, and I think, I know, but one of the core messages I try to deliver in speeches and things is that in the past, and I go back to last century because we're so embedded, we're so connected to the ways that we had this golden key, and the golden key was superior products or services or methods or whatever. And that was our charm and personality, our team, our resources. That was the golden key to success. And that's what unlocked the treasure chest of cash and sales and revenue inside companies. Now it's a combination lock. You've got to understand, if you want to truly optimize and unlock all the potential inside a company, you've got to go through a chain of events, a sequential approach. And I go back to the number one issue, and I'll share with you how I do it, is why are you in business?
Yeah.
Why do you exist? And I'll share with listeners, when I'm working with a firm and I have the executive team in the room, and it doesn't matter if they're a startup, 100 million, I've done this inside billion-dollar companies. I said, write out, please, on a piece of paper, what problem your business solves. And here's the interesting fact. In 18 years, almost 20 years now, as I go around the room, they all have different answers.
Yeah, that's pretty common.
And I stop there. And I mean, I could go further and
embarrass them.
People major hurt. But I just say, well, how do you feel? How do you feel about this? And for the first time ever, the team kind of looks around and goes, wow, we're not even clear on what we do. And I said, yeah. And I said, if you're confused in here, your teams are bewildered and your market is frightened, there's your problem. This is where it starts. And so I always go back to, why should you exist? Why should anyone care? And why should they give you money for what you do? And it's those overriding questions that if we can't answer and we're not absolutely clear, I don't know what messages are being sent to the teams and out to the marketplace. Well, I can tell you the wrong messages.
Yeah. Because if the leadership team is confused, priorities are confused, departments are confused, sometimes conflicts arise. But also, if you don't know what business you're in, what products do you develop? Right?
Well, wait a minute. Let me go back, because the subtlety here is important. They know what business they're in, but they don't know what problem they solve. So, in other words, all right, so you're a consultant. Why does anybody need a consultant? Why should you exist? Why do they need you versus anybody else? How do you solve the problem differently or better or faster or more cost effectively than anyone else? If you can't answer that question, then everything else ripple effects from right there. If you don't have clarity on your reason for being and the value and the potential value proposition you can deliver, then almost everything else is going to be wrong or off target.
So how do you move from there? How do you move from that point?
So now that, and this is this whole phase I call revenue ready, you talk about, okay, so here's the problem that's not being solved today. And let's talk about consulting. 8, 9 out of 10 projects fail. Yeah. They fail to deliver on time, budget, the deliverables, all that's right. Wow. Well, where's all the risk? Well, the risk is on the client. They paid the money, but they didn't get the results. So if you can come along, and I'm probably going to offer this down the road, I'll offer guaranteed results. Yeah. If you don't get the results that we talked through, I won't charge you. I'll give you all your money back. And it could be $100,000, $500,000. It'll be a big ticket. But that's the problem today, and that's the problem that needs to be solved. And that's what every business should look for, is to say, are we really bringing a unique angle to this? And it's funny, and I use this example because everybody in the world's eating pizza. Yeah. If you wanted to tap into the $40 billion pizza market, well, you better have the right strategy. You better understand what's the problem that's not being solved, because you can't be me too. You can't be like somebody else. Last century's paradigm, if I offer it, they will come. Yeah. No, you have to have an absolutely clear and compelling reason to come to you and no one else. And that's back to that problem. From there, the next step in the sequence, opening the combination lock, is what's your model going to be different? What are you going to offer in your model? Are you going to share the risk? Are you
you mean business model here, right?
Yes, in your business model, what will you offer? How will you do it differently? And I use an example like Amazon. Amazon has basically come along and said, wow, we'll offer you everything you can think of. We'll offer it cheap, get it to you next day. And by the way, if you don't like it, just send it back, we'll eat it. I mean, they've absorbed so much more risk than anybody else, and that's really been the secret to their success. We can talk about the internet, the digital strategy and all that, their logistics, but at the end of the day, they absorb more risk.
So why are companies not doing this? Because it's very intuitive. This is leadership 101. It's not new. So why are executives caught in an old paradigm? Because I can tell you right now, even people listening to this, they're going to remember it for 2 days, but they're going to switch back. And you've seen that, right?
I have clients in programs, and they'll say, like a year or two later, they go, oh my gosh, this was in my notes 12 months ago.
Year or two later, that means you're doing a pretty good job. Usually it's just 3 weeks later.
Yeah. They'll say, you probably said this 3 different times and I heard you. I just never owned what you said. So first of all, I don't think it's new. I don't think this level of sophistication is new because, again, and up until the pandemic, if you offered it, you could almost make money off anything. I mean, it was a situation where you just had to exist. You open a store, offered food or a bookstore or services, and you could generate clients and income. And yet, here's what's so fascinating is in my studies and research and being inside several thousand companies, even pre-pandemic, most of them weren't really making any serious money. True. They might have been growing, but they were profit poor, cash poor, and they struggled with cash on hand and cash flow and almost no working capital. But small businesses have almost no working capital, and part of that is because no one's going to give money because they don't know how to make money.
Yes.
So I think what's new is not running and starting and growing a business. What's new today, and my message is, you have to design your business from the beginning and how it will make money. Not hope that it will make money, and not, man, I've got a great service, or we offer the best sandwich, or whatever. You have to design your business today to make money from the very beginning.
You have to know how the dollar is going to move.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. I say it this way. The world has been built on trading products and services and time, consulting, for dollars. That model's stale and flawed. And today it's about leveraging the impact of the value of what you do, not trading for time, product, or service.
Yeah, it's from in consulting we say moving away from a variable cost model whereby if you don't work, you're not getting paid, which is the way most people are. You have to work to get paid, right?
Yeah, and that's trading or exchanging. So here's the issue: is that never scales.
Because you only have so much time in the day and you can only raise your fees
how
so
many
much.
hours can you work? How many, how many things can you do physically? So your model already has failure points because of the constraints versus if you stop training, but if you start leveraging. And here's an example. I can make X an hour with a client. I don't really typically ever use that model, but on occasion I do. Somebody says, hey, can I just buy an hour of your time and have you surgically analyze something that's going on? I said, okay, let's work it out. But at the same time, I can give a keynote speech and make 15, 20x.
Yeah.
Now, the hour is the hour. What's the difference? Well, in the speech, I can impact and sometimes even start to change the direction of a company in a speech. Well, that's significant value versus I spent an hour with the CEO. So the point being is that's being paid for the value, not being paid for the time. That's not trading the time.
Yes.
And it's very important to understand that because that's how you optimize. That's how you produce scaling against an hour versus finding ways to sell more hours.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the challenge here for the audience or our audience, is that consulting and business is very conservative. And a lot of people, what they do is the way they make decisions is not to look at what is intuitively correct. They simply work on a law of averages, whereby they say, I know 10 people who run their businesses this way. And they seem okay. They drive a Mercedes. So even though what Michael and Kent are telling me makes perfect sense, there's just 2 of these guys and 10 people are doing it differently. And I think what I hope the audience does listening to this is that just because 10 people do it doesn't make it right. The first rule of strategy is you must have a difference. You can't succeed in the market unless you have some point of differentiation in the way you solve a problem. It's not sustainable, and it's never going to be sustainable unless you have a point of difference, right? But you have to take that further and say, okay, how do I reinvent what I'm doing so that I'm not constrained by time and the fact that I have to, tell my wife I'm not going to be home for Thanksgiving every year because I need to work and work and work. And how far can you scale that? But, the challenge here, and maybe let's talk about this, is that when we're talking to smaller companies and entrepreneurs, they're going to get this because they are in the grindstone working day in and day out, right? They know what it's like that, hey, I've tried this for 3 years. It's not working. I'm doing everything I can, but I'm getting bigger, but my margin is the same or lower because I need to add a bigger cost base just to grow. So they're going to understand this. But I think, how do you get executives to understand this who run $4 billion companies? Because they're going to be, if things don't go well, they move from company to company. How do you get someone who doesn't necessarily share in the risk in total think like someone who shares in the risk? Because an entrepreneur will get it. They feel the pain. But someone who works for a company, they're going to get a salary anyway, whether or not they change what they're doing. So how do we get them to make that shift?
It's interesting. I, on occasion, get pulled into law firms because they need to grow and expand. And in many cases, I say, I really don't want to, and I'll tell you why. I don't want to come in and help you, and I'll tell you why. No one's accountable.
Yeah.
You're accountable by committees and partners. No one at the end of the day wakes up every day and says, is our farm growing and being more successful and making more money or not? And it's really just spread across partners and what I call a committee.
Yes.
And I think that's the same way a lot of times in consulting firms is it's spread across partners or committees, as opposed to there is somebody actually responsible for revenue growth, sales, and profitability. And they wake up every day with that mindset as opposed to, hey, I'm doing fine on my island. How are you doing? And if you're doing well, then I'll share with you. And if I'm not doing well, you still have to share with me. It's just an interesting dynamic of how the dollars go. What I found in both running companies is things really happen when people are accountable. And that's very different from responsible.
Yeah.
And I think that right there, and it's interesting that a lot of people are confused that they might use those words interchangeably, but they're not the same word. And I'll go back to that example where marketing might be accountable for leads and demand, but other departments are responsible, meaning that if marketing doesn't help everyone in the organization generate the demand necessary, then they don't get their bonuses or they don't get their pay or whatever that they should. They don't get the rewards. because they are under the pressure for the risk. I do want to go back, and you made something about it. It's yourself and myself, extolling these concepts. I've spent 18 years inside several thousand
Hmm.
companies in close to 36 countries now. I've got a passport with about 4 or 5 books stuck in it from traveling so much. And I spent a lot of those years understanding more from less, less from more, and learning incremental versus optimization and testing and proving in all kinds of companies to really be able to have those thousands of case studies
Hmm.
that say, here's why. And I went back, did the analysis over the last 5 years, and I said, why were certain people in our programs made literally retire tomorrow wealth and became millionaires and multimillionaires, and others with the same content, same programs, and I was providing the delivery. Why didn't they make it? And maybe one of the greatest ahas in my whole working career was discovering that most people are just business people, and even those that call themselves entrepreneurs, they're not entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
And that's another message that I hope I can get across to people listening to this, people running companies, is today where we are with the economy and the disruption, and the pandemic's going to come and go in some manner. There'll be something else. There'll be a crisis. There'll be a terrorist activity. It happens every, once or twice a decade, just a major catastrophe. And so it requires today, and I just put a tweet out the other day that said, the world doesn't need more entrepreneurs. We need more entrepreneurial people
Hmm.
solving problems faster and smarter than ever before. And that's back to one of your questions, is how do we get people to change? Well, we get them to start to understand, what does it mean to be entrepreneurial, and how do you create an organization filled with entrepreneurial people, not meaning they're all running off and starting their own companies. And that's a misnomer with what entrepreneurial means, but it means they're being innovative in their problem solving. They're being creative in their approach to strategies and their methods of change. They work within a team construct. They're held accountable. They're welcome to the risk reward type pay model. Those are entrepreneurial aspects, and that everyone from the CEO all the way down through the organization should have today, and they should work on it. But it's just the opposite. In most of the large organizations, they prevent people from being entrepreneurial, and they don't reward them, and they don't reinforce that kind of thinking behavior, thinking that they'll lose them, versus most people don't want to go off and start their own businesses and be out on their own island trying to survive. They want to be part of a great
Hmm.
structure, great construct, but they want the rewards to come with the risk.
Yes. A link to that, when you talk about how companies reward people and how they develop them, we have a lot of clients who go from, say, McKinsey or Bain to start their own businesses. It's very common. Before
Yeah.
10, 20 years ago, I would say the big leap was between investment banking and consulting back and forth. Then it became private equity, venture capital, management consulting. Now it's consultants going into San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and launching
Yeah.
businesses. And
Uh-huh.
every time I speak to clients, they always tell me, well, I understand business. So obviously I'm going to be successful launching a startup, right? But then I always tell them, but do you understand business? I mean, you worked at McKinsey for 3 years. You
Yeah.
analyzed, I don't know, you analyze a port, but launching a startup means you know how to make something, communicate it, get all consumers that you're targeting to see that what you're offering is different. Then you've got to create something to deliver this to consumers, take a payment from them, and make sure that payment covers your costs so that you can reinvest back and grow at a faster rate than your cost. I mean, that's business. It's not that you analyze the organizational design for a tech company, right? It's different. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, you've got to have the entrepreneurial drive, but you also have to be able to know what skills you don't know. And you have to fill those gaps. Like what you're saying, when you go into companies and you talk to CEOs, there are certain things they don't know, and you've got to fill those gaps for them. What do you think are the most common things people need to know, but sometimes they miss?
Well, I would go back to, and I was having flashbacks because I'm a corporate guy. I mean,
Yeah.
I climbed the ranks of two large corporations and made it almost all the way to the top of a multi-billion-dollar firm. And it was interesting, the skill set, and I was telling this to someone the other day, the skill set required to be successful in a matrixed organization is radically different than what it takes to start a business from scratch and build it selling air. Having said that, what isn't different is it's about making those connections, the network, and the relationships. And in a company of about 140,000 people, my skill set at one point in time was I could make one phone call and find the resource somewhere in the world I needed in the next 5 minutes. But that took 10, 15 years to develop that network and that capability. And that's yet the same thing you really need when you're on the outside. And the big difference I remember I just can't pick up the phone today and call some department in France and find a resource that's an expert in so-and-so. I'm out on Fiverr.
Yeah. It works.
I'm talking to somebody in Bulgaria about, hey, what's this going to cost to code this, develop this, or do this? And so Fiverr's my new HR department, or my new graphics department, and all that. For those that don't know, Fiverr is a platform for finding a talent and skill sets for part-time projects. And so, but I still go back to I love people that want to start and run a business, and you can be an entrepreneur or be entrepreneurial inside a company. And if you're going to be an entrepreneur or start a business, and those are two different things, you really have to be entrepreneurial. And I go back to, if you don't have a clear problem to solve, don't start a business. And a lot of my friends that were in and still are in the corporations, they come to me and they go, wow, the success you've had, and I really want that. You have freedom. You go where you want. You say no to people, clients and prospects. And I said, yeah, well, I paid a lot of dues to do that. And but it always goes back to what's broken that's not being solved. And so, my perfect client profile is private company under $100 million. And I work with all kinds of companies all around the world, but that's my perfect, because what they don't have a fractional CMO, fractional CSO, or fractional CR, or access to a full-time CSO, CMO, CRO. And so I can offer that model to them on a retainer basis. And it's great for them because a lot of these companies, they don't need a full CRO. They don't need a chief revenue operating officer, because they don't have 1,000 salespeople. They may have 50 or 100. And so you've got to look and say, well, what's not being served out there? What's not being solved? And then what can you offer, deliver to that? And you've got to be really clear. And then the second thing, and to help the audience that's listening is, and I learned this from a friend of mine, I talk about him a little bit, Mark Cuban, is go ask somebody to write you a check for it. So if you think you've got a great idea for a business, and you want to leave the corporate world, or you want to leave whatever you're doing and start something else, come up with the idea, the business model, then go to somebody and say, how much would you pay me for this? And would you write me a check right now?
That's a good test.
If they will, you might have a viable business. You're revenue ready. If they won't, go back to your model, go back to the problem. Because people will pay to solve pain, but they won't pay today just for services or products.
Yes. The paradigm has shifted because there's so much competition, and also most of these simple problems have been solved, right?
Well, I'd say they have, but now they're different. Now they're complex. And a great example, well, there's so many examples today. It's like anyone in complex sales today, they can't go inside their prospects' offices.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Well, so the classic old world last century sales strategy of product, price, and personality doesn't work, because they can't get inside to charm people, and they can't get around the departments to charm people. And so they're having to do it through Zoom and other methods. And there are a lot of people in complex sales, big ticket sales, that they're dying, they're struggling because their charm's not working through Zoom. And the sad part is they're not as in a system to open those doors and to be successful without their charm. They don't understand value propositions. They don't understand influence and power relationships inside organizations. So they can't navigate remotely or virtually.
Well, that's a good point, Julius. It's probably one of the most important points here. It's not enough to know how to use Zoom. You've got to have a business model now that works virtually, that is going to be able to create sales now that you're operating virtually. Just mastering Zoom is not changing your system. It's just mastering Zoom. I mean, if you're now going completely digital, do you have a way of collecting leads, qualifying it, making sure the high quality leads get to you, so that you don't waste time. But most people haven't thought that far into building a system. All they're saying is that I need to work from home, so let's have some Zoom calls and use the same system I was using before. And obviously that's going to fail, right? Or at least maybe not fail, but not be as efficient and not scale the way you're talking about scaling, which is scaling the revenue return side, but keeping your cost base roughly the same. I want to switch gears a little bit, Joe.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the emotional side of things. I'll give you an example of this, right? Because it's quite interesting. So many years ago when I was a partner, I was talking to the chief marketing officer of that stage, one of the world's largest coal companies. And we were looking at the portfolio of assets they had, which is quite expansive. And we were looking at the return on assets across each mine. And clearly some of them are laggards, like a 3% return, which is lower than the cost of capital. And then there's these jewels. And I want to know, why do you keep your laggards? I mean, these mines earn no return. Why do you keep them? And he told me, what do you mean why we keep them? Don't you read the press? We spent like 5 years trying to buy them. Of course we're going to keep them. But this is, we never talk about this, but we always make it sound as if something makes perfect sense, people are going to do it. But here's a pretty smart guy. He went on to become a successful CEO. But his mind was, we fought a big war to get these assets. We're never going to let them go. And I think with a lot of companies, especially in the bracket that you like, $100 million, whereby many of those people were involved in the battles to grow and become something, there's a lot of emotional attachment to decisions. How do you get them to see beyond the emotion?
Well, I think most important thing is to be empathetic to where they are and why they are where they are, and to understand the rationale behind it. And you made me really think of something that's interesting today in complex sales, and I tell this to all my clients because if you're in services, you're in consulting, you're in complex sales. It's not good enough to have a 3.6 or 9-point value proposition based on business impact, new capabilities, solution attributes, because at the end of the day, it's the emotional value proposition that always trumps the logical value proposition.
Yes.
And I said, when you can learn how to work on that emotional value proposition and understand why they're doing what they're doing, then you can get change, and then you can get people to maybe look at things differently. And I think that's a great example of what you brought up is, people connected to the past. I think it's also, because we have sweat and tears in this, or I'm connected, or I made this decision, or we've sunk cost. I mean, you could go down the list of all the reasons that people do things or still doing things. It also reminds me, many times I've been in situations where I ask, do you feel I'll be able to move you off that?
That's a good question.
If you tell me it's a deal breaker, that's fine. We'll move on. But is there a way I could get you to move off that? If I could show you a different way, would you be interested? Or what would it take to be comfortable doing things differently? And I think in so many cases, you have to lead them versus convince them. You have to work through with them why they are where they are and talk to it. But it's understanding that emotional value proposition is really important. And too many times, and probably in consulting, we stay focused on the logical, the numbers, the streamlining, the oh my God, look, after we do our OD work, how beautiful your organization is going to look. Yeah, but so-and-so doesn't have a job anymore, and they're one of my most loyal employees, and those kinds of things. So that's where I feel it's so important to be holistic about everything you do and everything you say, is to incorporate the soft side of business, and not just the hard areas, but the soft side. And that includes the values, and that includes the emotions, and that includes strategy, and some of those areas that aren't visible versus process and people and performance and production. But that's kind of my approach, is just to try to uncover and discover. And it also makes me think, I'm working with a company. They're about a $50 million family business. And I said, would you ever want to sell the company? And the CEO said, no way. It's been in our family for I can't remember how long. And I said, would you at least want to think about, if you had to sell it, what we would do? And he said, I could do that, but I don't want to ever sell it. And I said, great. All I want you to do is think about, what would it take to sell this for the most value? That's the direction I want to go, but I know you never want to sell it. So that's kind of my approach or my style to that kind of question.
I think it's a good approach, because you are getting clarity on where the person is on the spectrum of how comfortable they are without making any assumptions. And you're also getting them to see where you lie on things. I think it's the most transparent way possible. So you've worked all over the world. What do you think are some of the sort of best practices you've seen? I'm sure there are cultural differences and so on. But what do you think works well? If we had to advise clients how to start thinking in this way, what would you tell them should be their starting point?
Well, it depends on where you work. And I moved over to Asia. I lived in Hong Kong for just over 3 years, and I almost get a little frustrated when I hear the ASEAN countries or the Asian countries. Yeah. They're all the same. And I go, they're really not.
They're not
you go into each country, their culture, their beliefs, their labor laws, everything, their religions are so different. If anything, it's learning how to be sensitive to all those things and having different gears. Working in Germany, you just be in their face, push it, jam it, bring your Western attitudes. Everybody got along.
Yeah.
You try that in China or Singapore, and they just will look at you and nod and agree, and then behind the scenes they despise you or hate you. You're still a Gaizing and Guilo and all that. So I think, if anything, as you work into the different areas, and this is very important about defining who your perfect client profile is and where they are, is being sensitive and understanding of how they see things and how they want to do things. For a great example, I remember in Japan, my first flight in, I just met somebody and we talked and greeted, and I thought I did everything right. And then I got pulled aside and we're having coffee, and my mentor goes, "You didn't look at the back of their business card." And I'm like, "What?" He goes, "You didn't read their card and show respect, and then you didn't turn over and read the back of it. Don't do that again."
Wow, so such a subtle difference.
Yes, and I'm like, "Oh, okay, thank you." And just, hundreds and hundreds of examples like that.
So you have to be attuned to localizing the advice. That's really, you've got to know the sort of pillars and the building blocks and the key principles, but it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. You've got to know where you are in the process, and localize things.
And have different gears.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is know where you can gung-ho it, Japanese term. And know where you have to dial it back and just listen and observe for maybe a few meetings, and you earn respect before you earn the relationship. But understand those things as you go into these different countries. And my attitude was I would dial back anything I thought or any of my assumptions before I landed, so that I could kind of pick up on the subtleties. And because even though you're an outsider, you don't want to be perceived as an outsider. And it's so much like power and influence inside corporations. If you're not on the inside, you'll never know what's going on.
That's true. Well, thank you so much, Ken. I enjoyed this. I think our listeners will like it as well.
Yeah.
So any advice, any parting words before we wrap up?
Well, I think the most important we covered is that any successful business today, you've got to focus on how do you actually create revenue and money, and following a sequence, following a roadmap is more serious today than ever. And the fact that a superior product or service or your great past experience or portfolio isn't good enough anymore. You've really got to understand that success comes through how do you open a combination lock versus just I throw this out there and see what sticks.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things you've talked about quite a lot, and I like it, is that don't assume you have to have this massive cost base that grows in step with your revenue. Yeah. I mean, that's really the last thing you want to do, right? You've got to rethink your systems and processes to, as you say, grow the revenue side, not just the cost side as well. Thank you so much, Ken.
Yes.
Take care.
Oh, more than welcome. Certainly enjoyed talking to you.
And you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing the episode. Finally, I want you to remember that the only way to get access to our special offers, the only way to get our special pricing, and the only way to get samples of our content is to join the list on firmsconsulting.com. It's the only way also to get access to our unique advanced content that we make available to insiders. So if you want to get a sneak peek of things, test it out, see what's in there, this is the place to go. And finally, I want to thank you again for making us one of the largest podcast channels around the world for careers and for the 2 million downloads and counting.